So this screencast is gonna outline the bits and piece of code that I did for the multiplayer project. And there's a couple of things that I did with the features that is existing in the game. And the first one that I want to outline is gravity. So implementing gravity before, in order to implement jumping action. So in order to implement gravity, I created the variable m gravity in the entity. So every entity in the game is gonna get affected by gravity. So basically, it's just a constant float that is have 500 velocity, and then so in here in the update current function, if the entity is not static, so if it's something that is able to move, for example, like the stickman, the stickman or pickups, then apply the gravity, extra the gravity, then move as the velocity if there's a velocity. But if it's static, like the island, for example, so do not move at all. So that's the first thing that I did. So now in the incremental of this is the jumping action. So I spent quite a time to actually figure out how the jumping action would work. So basically I create so in here I map it as a W key for the player 1 and up key for the player 2, and then it's basically just call a jump methods inside the stickman. So if I go there, so all the jumping method do is just saying if the player is not currently jumping, which is this is to prevent a double jump, so they cannot just spam jumping and just fly up to the air. And then if the time in the air is not zero, so it's actually currently falling and stuff like that. So again, it's prevent the same thing. So even though the jumping is done, but if the player is still in the air, sometimes if I don't implement this, the stickman will able to double jump. And then it's not just double, but like it's able to increment jumping. So with this F, I only able to jump when I'm not when I'm on the ground. So that is set. So jump method is just to setting the M is jumping through, and then I have this method check is jumping. So basically, if the player is currently not getting punched, so we do not want the player able to jump when it's getting punched. So when it's getting punched, it should not able to do anything. Therefore, this is the if statement is over here. And then after that, we check if the player is jumping. Now, I have a time in the air. So time in the air is an incremental time. So it's like a countdown, a count up, whatever it is, to track how much time the stickman is actually off the ground. So this is saying the time in the air. If it's the initial jump, play a music like a jumping sound effect, and then after that just implement with the delta time of the time, and then I basically have a two timer. So the first one is the jump impulse time. So the jump impulse time is when the initial jump, the velocity is really high, and then the second one is what I call a hang velocity. So it's significantly uh, less velocity than the impulse, so that would create some nice buffer effect. So it's not just teleporting right away, but there's a slowdown after quite some of the timer. So set the jump impulse time to be like, for example, 0.2 seconds, and the max air time, so the total from the ground into the highest point is like 0.5 seconds. So it would do a really ridiculous amount of velocity. So like if I remember correctly, it's like minus 1,300 for the jump impulse for zero point 0.2 seconds, and then right after that do a hang velocity for like minus 300 velocity for the next 0.2 seconds. Now after the max airtime is done, so basically the stickman reach the highest point, say that the jumping is false. Now, we also need to reset the time in the air, but we don't want to reset the time in the air when the stickman reaches the highest point. So the way I reset the time in the air is on collision with the island. So when a player have a collision with an island, set the time in the air to be 0. So therefore, it's indicating that I am not in the air anymore. Even though I'm dome jumping, I'm not in the air anymore. So that is the first action of punching with a little bit of physics with gravity. Now, the second feature that I did, so when I say first and second, that is just based on my timeline on creating this feature. So the second feature is creating two local player with different key binding. So the way I did it is to use a data table or player data. Sorry, let me open the .hpp. Sorry, data table. There you go. So the player data just contains the key binding and the category ID. The category ID here is just to determine which player it is. So later on, when on the player, we can see that so the command able to get the correct category ID. So if we look at the implementation, so it's basically just storing a key binding with A as a move left, D move right, etc. with its respected action ID for the first player, and then the second player have the left, move left, right, and right. Now, because we are using data table, we need to adjust player.cpp to implement that data table. So in here, usually we just basically when we if it's just a one player, we declare the key binding here and then like etc. But since we're using the key binding on the data table, so we just basically just assign the key binding based on the type. So if it's player 1 uses this key binding, if it's a second player uses the next key binding. Now the interesting here is to pair the action bindings with the key binding. So this is why the category ID is really important. So for all of the action to not bind the same category, we need to a dynamic category. So that's why we store that on the data table. And then right after that as well, I need to have two instances of player. So that is getting on the context. So in the context, usually there's only one player, but now we need two players. Now, this is not the optimal way to do it. The optimal way to do it is to support many players as we want. So we could have an STD factor, a factor type of players, and then in the application, we can declare to how many player it is, or like based on the connection, or like based on the lobby state, whenever who is able to join in, or like so the user can just put in how many players is it gonna be, and then in the I imagine in the application here it's gonna look through how many players that they need. So but at the moment I only have two players as a local variable and the application. So that way it will carry through the context, and then the world and game state able to differentiate which player it is. So that is how I develop the local the local multiplayer. The next is punching action. Now the punching action requires, so I'm just gonna run the code a bit and to explain it. So the local the punching action requires a collision detection and a collision response. So basically saying if the player collides each other, and then if they press the punching button, they will able to punch each other. So that is the gist out of it. So if we see, I'm just gonna play quickly. Right. So as you can see, the bounding rectangle on the each player. So if the first player, which is a blue stick guy, and then the second player is the red stick guy. Let's see if I can zoom this out. Is colliding each other. So if the player 1 able to enter space, which is my punch action, it should run a punching action, which is push the second player to the direction of the first player facing. So if you do that again. So, and then the base of the game is whenever you get hit, you get a damage multiplier. So the more you get hit, the more further you goes. And then if you go out of bounds like this, you will lose, or the other player wins. So basically, what I needed for punching action is a way to get the direction of the first player, and then get the position of the first player regardless, depending to the second player, and then I need to be able to push the second player into the direction that is the first player is facing. So the collision detection itself, there's nothing special, so it's all the same with the other collision detection. Now the fun stuff is on the collision response itself. So the handle collision. So I have a lot of scenario there. So basically, all of this if statement is checking the player position with the player position and the direction that is facing, and then setting the punch direction. So I have 3 scenario. So the first scenario is when the player 1 is punching and the second player is not punching. The second scenario is the vice versa, and the third scenario is when both of them are punching at the same time. So because this is in order to get because if we just leave it as it is like this will give the first player an advantage. So no matter what the player 2 is punching or not punching, it will check the first player first, and then if it's true, then so at this time we will allow them punching at the same time, and it goes to different direction. Now inside those scenario we have different scenario as well. Basically it's just checking if the player 1 is in the left side of the player 2, then we set the direction to the right of the player 2 got off. So that's why the direction here is really important, because we don't want it goes to the wrong direction. For example, it's the player 1 is on the left of the player 2, but when the player 1 punches the player 2, the player 2 goes to the left instead of the right. So that's not what we want. Therefore we have the if statement in every scenario. So this is saying if the player 1 is in the left of the player 2, set the player 2's punch direction, the get punch direction into plus 1, which is to the right. And then this is the vice versa. And now if it's the player 2, it's the same thing, but now it's checking player 2 position regarding depending into player 1, then set the direction to player 1. Now the interesting here, because no matter where it is, as long as player 1 and the player 2 is colliding and then punching the same, it should go in the opposite direction. So if the player 1 in the left and the player 2 in the right, then it should go. The player 1 should go in the left more, and then the player 2 should go to the right. So basically, that is just set punch direction is just getting. Setting the direction where the player will fly off, where it's get punched. Now, the kit punch itself is very similar to jumping methods that I developed. So the get punch is just setting that the player right now is getting punched, so it's still in a it's flying off. So now I have the same like there's a little check jumping. I have check is punch as well. So saying if it gets punched, I will have uh, the countdown, like how long I'm getting punched, like how long I'm moving to the X direction, and then basically the same as well with the jumping. I have impulse and hang time as well, so that means I'm not teleporting straight away to the location. And this damage, the only difference with the jumping is just the damage multiplier. So the damage multiplier is just the direction. So if we see here, the set punch direction. So set punch direction is the one that we set before we get punched, and then this is +1 or -1. So either of the two. So if we get +1, then we go to the right. If it's -1, we go to the left. So and then every time we get punched, we add the damage multiplier to 0.5. So therefore, uh, every time the stick man get punched, the higher damage multiplier here, so it will go much more further. So that is the punching action that I developed. Now, the next thing is animation. In terms of animation, there is nothing special on the animation.cpp itself, so it's using the generic animation. The interesting one is the sprite that I use. That's not the one. So I able to get this. I will provide the link on the zip file as well. But I'm able to get this sprite sheets. So basically, this is the stances. This is the run, jump, and combo, which is I only take these three to work with, and then that's all I need. So basically, the process that I went is to just crop the ones that I need on pixel editor. So I crop that one, and then just the first one of this because this jump doesn't really make sense on my mind. And then the punching is just this three. And then I also get this guy over here to just demonstrate how he getting punched. So when he flies to the left or the right. So now after I crop that one, I make I color them. So this is, even though this is PNG, this is not a transparent, so I need to make them transparent and then color the heads to blue and red. So that means that the respective is player 1 is blue, and then if it's red, then it's player 2. So this is what I have at the moment. So you can see this is just the normal stance. This is so because the direction is really important here, and then we're using the generic animation. I cannot tell specifically to choose, oh, this animation is run backwards, which is pretty weird. So that way I need to generate, for example, this running left. So running left is basically just running right, but I need to flip them. So it will go through here, as opposed to if it's running right, it's just a different direction. So if you notice, the end state and the beginning state of running right and left is a bit different. So in the running left, this is going to be the first state, the first frame, this is second frame, and etc. But it doesn't really matter in the running because it has a lot of frames, and then it's going to look through anyway. But it's not the same case with punching. So punching has the same direction issue as well, so I need to flip them. But I cannot just simply flip them and then just be done with it, because this punching I'm not gonna be looping through. So it's only going to be do once when the player press the spacebar or an enter bar. So it's a bit different because if you notice, this is the beginning frame, this is the second frame, and then this is the third frame. So if I just flip that, so then this is the beginning frame, and then this is second and then third one. So it will create an animation like pulling the punches instead of throwing them. So that's why I need to crop them respectively and then switch the places and then make sure that they have the same pixels with the width and the width, especially because the height is going to be the same regardless. If you notice as well, there is a slight difference here. So like there's a big gap here. So that is intended. So I pull this second is a bit front. So that way the animation will so jumping to the front instead of just jumping stay in place. So that's it's barely able to you barely able to see it in the actual game, but it does make a difference when it's just punching in the place or like punching forward. So that is the animation, and for the implementation of the animation sprites is on the stickman. So this is all the settings of the animation. So running right, I specified the way. So the height is always the same. The width might be different, but the width is just, it doesn't really matter that much because it has to be transparent. So you don't really see the difference on the notice. It's just as long as the stick man itself is the same size, it won't be noticeable. And then that is running right, left, jump, and then there's a on the current draw current. Sorry, I have this if statement. So basically, if uh, there's certain condition that I want like the game to draw the animation instead of the usual standing. So this is all of the scenario. And then this if statement is not very safe. So in a sense that some animation, the top animation get priority on top of the other one. So if you're actually in the air and then in the air, you should have a jumping animation. So here's the as if in the air and jumping animation. But at the same time, if you're in the air but you're punching as well, so it would not render the jumping animation, but it will render the get punch animation because the punch have priority, so it will punch in the air instead of like jumping. In a sense, it might be a good thing, but this if statement is never really got into detail, and then it's never really safe. So if there is a time to improve for the next iteration, this is where I will be looking at straight away and then try to draw out. Okay, this is the logic of the if statement. The similar if statement is happening on the update current as well. So which one I want to update first? Again, this is have like some kind of priority in it. Now, notice the a bit difference in here. So basically, when the animation of the punching and finish, I want to set the punching status into false. So instead of just reset it by time, so I just want to reset it. Oh, okay, you're finished. So you're finished punching, so your status should be false. So this is needed to be like this because if I don't do this, the player able to pre-punch it. So basically, even though they're not colliding, and then they press the punch key, the punch, the M is punching is going to be set into true, even though it's not colliding. So when they collide, they will immediately able to punch the other guy. So that is the huge advantage. So that's why this is really needed. So just a way to reset after the punching animation is finished. This is the same thing, it's just different direction. Shaders. So there's not a lot of like shaders, but I did implement the bloom effect from the code that is in the class. But the only thing that I did different is just to get rid of the downsample here, and then I just last the blur multipass into just one loop, so that way it's not as shiny, it's not as blooming as it is, so it's able to seeable now, so that's why it's kind of nice now. is not too bright as before. So I think that's it. So that is all the outlining things that I uniquely do. Obviously I also implement a lot of like laser detection and stuff, but all of the codes is just from the class. So I just pull in from the latest code and then implement into this project. But I do say they sometimes quite a lot require like troubleshooting skills and stuff like that. So I did. So I just want to say that I did a lot of debugging and stuff, and then make sure the implementation is actually correct. And some some implementation just have to require some logic as well, especially because we're using multiplayer on the local, which is the challenge, the challenge of just instead of just copy pasting, you need to uh, actually think whether the code that you're pulling from the class is gonna affect the multiplayer or not. But yeah, that is basically all of the things that is implemented to the game that is new from the class. So thank you for watching.